Hi everyone, today I'm bringing you my comprehensive Stormbrand Assassin Guide. Stormbrand is one of the best and most versatile skills in all of Path of Exile, and even after the Harvest League changes, it remains an absolute powerhouse of a skill that has an S-tier performance in virtually every type of content, including fast mapping, buzz killing, and even 100% Delirium maps. If you ever wanted to have a single character that can easily do all the content in the game, Stormbrand is for you. Before we get into the guide itself though, it's important to discuss what this build is and what it isn't. You see, there are many great league starters such as Poison BV that will get you to red maps on a 20C budget. Stormbrand is not one of these builds. Rather, Stormbrand makes for a great second character. Upon the start of a typical league, most of the items recommended in this guide will either be very expensive such as Void Batteries and Impulse's Broken Heart, or they simply won't even exist yet such as Power Charge Rings and Replica Soul Tether. Stormbrand is a great currency generator as it allows you to access both bossing and Delirium maps without having to make multiple characters, but you will want to have some starting currency on hand before you begin building such a character. It is also crucial to understand why we play an assassin and not one of the other ascendancies. There are two main ways to scale Stormbrand damage effectively, either through power charge stacking or cold conversion. Cold conversion is best played as an elementalist, occultist, or inquisitor, and it has a much higher damage ceiling in comparison to this build. However, it will require about 2 mirrors worth of currency investment to begin pulling ahead. On the other hand, power charge stacking will cap out at about a maximum of 80 exalts, but it absolutely murders all endgame content anyway, so I can't in good faith recommend playing cold conversion as you're essentially wasting multiple mirrors in return for overkill damage and nothing more. Cold conversion also tends to not run 6 brand jewels and leaves you with hardly enough mana to brand recall, meaning that in addition to overkill damage, you're also paying for decreased functionality and smoothness. When it comes to power charge stacking, Assassin is the clear winner, and for these reasons, that is the ascendancy we are going to use. At the end of this guide, I have included additional gameplay footage for those that want to see what they're in for. There are timestamps in the description, as well as a link to the forum guide which contains a number of topics not included here, such as leveling through the axe and even to level 100. This video is going to focus primarily on gearing and the passive tree. Whilst the video guide is going to discuss all the options in depth, I also recommend the written guide as it has pre-filtered trade site links that will take you directly to the page that you need to go to buy the item. This is going to quickly tell you how much the item currently costs, and it's also going to take a lot of the legwork out of buying the item yourself. Our passive tree is pretty self-explanatory, however I'm going to go through it anyway. So we're going to start out by just coming out here and going down to get the life and the crit nodes here. Then we're going to work our way towards the life and ES nodes here, pick up the timeless jewel here, and the timeless jewel notable. We come up and we go across to the brand wheel and the second life and ES wheel here. We go up and get our first cluster jewel set up here. We go all the way across, we get a jewel, we get our next power charge, we get more brand nodes, we get some life, we get some power charge scaling here that is really important. We go across and we grab our second cluster jewel setup. As we come down, we're picking up some crit, some additional life, a third power charge, we're getting Runebinder, which is really important to allowing 2 brands to be attached at once. This effectively just doubles our DPS against bosses. We come down, we get an additional jewel socket, we get more life, and we get our third cluster jewel setup. This is a pretty standard assassin tree. There's not really much else to say, you're just getting life and damage the most efficient ways as possible. If you don't get the third cluster jewel setup, there are some crit nodes here, or area nodes here that you may be interested in. If you're putting an inspired learning into your build, it will go into this jewel socket, and you'll be picking up Mystic Bulwark with Prodigal Perfection as well to activate the inspired learning. And important to note that we also gain our first power charge via an anointment rather than paying into it on the tree. It's only 3 points saved, but no big deal. As for ascendancies, we want to get Mistwalker, Unstable Infusion, Deadly Infusion, and Opportunistic. There isn't really any alternatives here, except if you're doing Delirium maps. Instead of Mistwalker, you're going to be taking Noxious Strike to allow for self-poisoning, which is going to be explained later. For weapons, we typically have a couple of options. Agnorod West is a really good budget option. It's giving us increased lightning damage dispels, increased levels for our lightning spell gems, and a whopping 20% lightning penetration. It also gives us access to a cheap 6-link so that we can avoid buying a 6-link Impulse's Broken Heart, and it gives us access to the staff nodes on the tree, which are some of the best nodes per point. One of the reasons we would use Agnerold West is because at the start of a league, buying a 6-link Impulse's Heart and 2 Void Batteries is typically very expensive. You can get this for about 1 Exalt 6-linked, and it's going to give you only about 30% less damage than Void Batteries. On the other hand, Void Batteries are going to give you quite a lot in terms of usability. The increased cast speed lets you get your brands up faster, the increased crit chance allows us to scale all our damage better. Increased max mana means that we have more mana to brand recall with all our mana reservation, and you're also getting +2 power charges by having 2 of these Void Batteries. It's hard to pass up Void Batteries if you can afford to get them. When it comes to body armor, Impulse's Broken Heart is pretty core to the build. It's got a very fat life roll on it, and it gives us really strong explosions right off the bat. Buying this is going to allow your Stormbrand, which is primarily a single target ability, to start exploiting packs very easily. The only downside to it is that the explosions don't shock, thus the outer mobs on a pack of mobs won't also explode. That's really only a problem for Porcupines. Everything else it's absolutely fine on. You shouldn't be looking to upgrade to an Exploity chest until you can afford an elevated Exploity chest with an Awakener Slime chest. My written guide covers pretty much what you want to be doing to craft one of these and what your options are. They mainly consist of either Crusader and Hunter or Crusader and Redeemer. You should go for Crusader and Redeemer if you're playing with a Badge of the Brotherhood, but if not, you should go for Crusader Hunter. The Hunter variant gives you access to Spell Crit and an additional Max Curse, which is a lot of extra damage. It's by far the best choice. We have a lot of options when it comes to helmets. The budget one is going to simply just be an enchanted helm that has a 12% Stormbrand Lightning Penetration enchant on it. You can scour and alch it or put essences on it to get the stats you want, and the enchant will stay. There's not much else to say here. It's just getting 12% extra Lightning Pen into your build relatively cheaply. The next option up is going to cost you a few exalts, and it's a +1 power charge Warlord helm. You can't do much else with this since you'll lose the +1 power charge if you try and roll other stats on it, and I also wouldn't recommend you using Harvest Crafts on it. The reason is that you can use this helmet as a base to make the premium options. When it comes to the premium options, we then have 3. So you can Awakener Slam the Warlord helm with either a Hunter helm, a Redeemer helm, or a Crusader helm. The Hunter and the Crusader helm are very close in terms of damage output. The Hunter helm grants lightning damage to spells, whereas the Crusader helm gives nearby enemies -9 to lightning resist. This one will only really pull ahead if you don't have enough lightning penetration in your build already, but otherwise the Hunter one with lightning damage to spells is going to come out a little bit stronger. And then the final option is the Redeemer base, which gives us 5% reduced mana reservation. You should only really go for this option if you're planning on using a Wrath Zealotry double Watcher's Eye, and you use this in combination with a level 4 Enlighten to fit Zealotry and Wrath into your build while still having enough mana left over for other things. I kind of wouldn't recommend this unless you're trying to really min-max the build at the highest level. There are explicit instructions for crafting each one of these helms on the guide, and I really would recommend going to this because this is what I've gotten the most messages for. I've seen about 20 or so bricked helmets because people didn't really follow the instructions at all and tried to make it themselves. It's pretty important to get this one right. Basically, it comes down to getting a Hubris Circlet with a Stormbrand enchant already on it, and then applying either the Crusader, the Hunter, or the Redeemer influence, and then Awakener slamming the mid-range base that has +1 power charge onto that helm. That's the correct way to do it, but again, you can just go to the written guide and you'll find pretty explicit instructions there. We have a lot of options when it comes to rings as well in this build. The budget option are getting 2 stone rings or Vermilion rings with life and resists, although I would personally recommend getting Vermilion rings. The reason for this is that early on in our build, we tend to lack a lot of life and be particularly squishy, and Vermilion rings allow you to squeeze some extra life into your build before you can get it elsewhere, such as on jewels. Once you're ready to upgrade from those, Curse on Hit rings are the next best thing. Now, providing you're not getting a curse from your gloves, you're probably going to want to get at least 1 from a ring. Your options are Conductivity, Elemental Weakness, or Assassin's Mark. If you get Conductivity, you're going to need either a Synthesized ring or a Crusader ring. Elemental Weakness comes only from Synthesized rings, and Assassin's Mark comes from Shaper rings. There are links in the written guide for all these. You should pretty much have a browse around and figure out what you want and what has the kind of stats you want. But don't spend too much money getting a really good one of these, because we want to upgrade to +1 power charge rings as soon as we can. The reason for this is because we're power charge stackers, and rings are one of the only slots where you can get power charges, so you should pretty much get one of these as soon as they come on the market. They're probably going to take a few days in most leagues to get onto the trade site, and they're going to be mirrored. Now, they're not actually mirrored, but rather people have used fractured fossils on them. Doesn't really matter what other stats comes on the ring, however, we only care about the implicit of +1 maximum power charges, so don't be afraid to just buy the cheapest one on the market. It's probably going to cost you at the start maybe 5 to 7x, though they tend to come down quite a lot as the league goes on. And again, really, we don't care about any of the other stats on here. You're probably going to lose life and resist when you make this switch, so you should prioritize getting life and resist from the less important slots. This is something you absolutely should prioritize as soon as you can. In this build, our Amulet is one of the strongest slots. The reason is because both the budget and the premium option are insanely powerful. I'm going to talk about the premium option first, and that is Badge of the Brotherhood. Most of you know this as a chase item. It's going to set you back about 30 exalts, depending on the league and the time of the league that you buy it. The thing is, though, it's not actually the strongest option in this build, so when you get a Badge of the Brotherhood, you're going to have to change your body armor to allow yourself to build frenzy charges, and that's going to cause you to run a weaker body armor. Additionally, you're not going to be able to use the Militant Faith jewel that provides inner conviction, and so you're probably going to use Glorious Vanity for the Corrupted Soul keystone. Now, the problem here is that Badge of the Brotherhood grants a lot of extra mobility and defenses, but it pales in comparison to the budget option of Ephemeral Bond. Ephemeral Bond is an item that flew under the radar during Heist League. It's going to cost you 1C most of the time that you buy it, although at the start of the league it may be 10 to 20C. But it's a really wonderful item. So it gives you quite a lot of all resistances, it gives you 30% crit multi, and an absolute shit ton of lightning damage per power charge, which is really hard to pass up on. This is worth multiple Crusader rings with the same mod. It really, if anything, should be nerfed or made also quite rare, like Badge of the Brotherhood. There's nothing that comes close to this much damage. The only real downside is 90% less power charge duration. This isn't a problem most of the time, because Stormbrand hits so fast that we're going to jump straight back up to our maximum power charges. But if you're using Replica Inya's Epiphany, the boots, they scale movement speed based off power charges, so if you're not constantly in combat, you're going to lose your movement speed. Not much more to say here. You should use Turbulent or Prismatic Catalysts on this one, either to buff the all resist or the lightning damage per power charge, and I would recommend doing the lightning damage per power charge because it really is just an insane amount of damage. I'll talk about Anoints real quick. Explosive Runes is the budget option that you probably want to get if you're using Void Batteries already. It only costs an Amber and 2 Azure Oils to get. It's going to give you an additional brand, some brand damage, and brand attachment range. These bonuses aren't quite worth the amount of points that we spend on the tree to get, so you can anoint it on for some cheap additional power, but don't feel bad when you have to drop it eventually. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Counterweight. So this is really good if you're still using the Agnorod West staff. It's going to give 60% crit chance and 30% crit multi, which is absolutely insane. And it only costs you 1 clear oil, 1 amber oil, and a silver oil, so you can obtain it pretty cheap. However, the premium anoint, and the one that we're going to want in pretty much anything that comes close to a min-max build, is the infused anoint. Now, that gives us +1 power charges. We don't really want to spend the 4 points to pick it up on the tree, although you should if you're not using the anoint. Nothing much to say here other than +1 power charge makes our entire build better because everything we get scales with power charges. It is going to set you back a crimson and 2 silver oils, however, so it's a little more expensive than the other 2 options, but as long as you've upgraded to Void Batteries, you pretty much want this. There's not really any other alternative. For belts, at the start of the league, you can either get a Stygian Vice with really good life and resist, or just a Doriani's Invitation with Lightning Leech. It's important when buying the Doriani's Invitation to take note of the fact that there are multiple versions of them and you want the one that gives Lightning Leech. It's not really important which one you choose because you're going to want to be upgrading from a belt pretty quickly, and the belt is not a particularly strong slot for us early in a league. After you're done with these, you can move on to the Replica Soul Tether. Now, at the start of the league, this won't even exist. They tend to come onto the market on about day 2, 3, or even 4 of a league, and they come at about 7 exalts. However, it does give you access to the Corrupted Soul Keystone. This is otherwise available with the Timeless Jewel Glorious Vanity, but what it does is it gives you 20% of max life as extra max energy shield, and then on top of that, the belt gives 6%. So a total of 26%, and then with Catalyst you can buff that to 27%. This isn't pretty much an entire defensive layer, and for a build as squishy as ours, this gets us pretty far. The final option is a Headhunter. Pretty much what I play with most of the league and what I would recommend. These aren't cheap, pretty much one of the most expensive items in the entire game. If you want its effect early in a league, such as for Legion farming or stuff like that, an Inspired Learning is going to be a pretty good replacement. Inspired Learnings will be about 1/3 of a Headhunter in terms of efficacy, as a Headhunter steals 3 buffs and an Inspired Learning only steals 1, but they tend to be quite cheap. They're usually 1 to 4 exalts depending on the day that you buy them and whether you get lucky with them. They will require taking extra nodes on the tree, but it's pretty much as good as it gets. Headhunter, though, pretty much enables you to do 100% Delirium maps. It just makes the entire game easier, and it's something you should aim towards getting with this build, because this build just works a lot better with a Headhunter. For gloves, we have quite a few options. The budget option is going to just be Energy Shield based gloves with life and resist. Not much else to say here. They don't offer a lot of power, but they're going to be really cheap, so they're an easy pickup. Next up is Curse on Hit gloves. There are many different ways to obtain these. So you can either get rare corrupted gloves with elemental weakness on hit, you can get Hands of the High Templar with elemental weakness on hit, or synthesized gloves with conductivity on hit. So the rare gloves are typically going to be the cheapest and the weakest. The Hands of the High Templar will probably be the most expensive, but they come with inherent life and resist, and then you can usually find other useful implicits on them. And the synthesized Curse on Hit gloves are my personal recommendation, because you can roll the rest of the item unlike the other two. And of course, you're going to just slap on life and resist. Not much else you're going to be picking up here. The premium option is Unnerve on Hit and Culling Strike Fingerless Silk Gloves. These are obtained via an Awakener Orb. There is a guide to crafting them on the written guide, and I would really recommend following this, as a few of you have already contacted me to show me your bricked gloves because you didn't follow the guide here. But the main thing here is that we're just going to get Culling Strike, which is about 10-11% more damage, Unnerve enemies on hit, which is worth about 1 brand loyalty. It's another 10% more damage, and then usually life and resists are going to be applied via harvest crafting, since you're not typically going to hit them naturally. Boots are by far the weakest slot in our entire build, and the main reason for this is that we don't have any particularly important mods that we can get on boots. The budget options are to go for a pair of 2-tone boots with life resist and low movement speed, or you can get Inya's Epiphany. The main difference between these options is that the Inya's Epiphany will give you some damage scaling off your power charges, but you're giving up resists here. Our build does tend to end up pretty resist-starved once you go for power charge rings, so I would leave the boot slot to last so that you can figure that out at the end, after you've seen how many resists you're losing from upgrading to rings and whatnot. When you're ready to upgrade your boots, you have 2 options, and those are Tailwind boots or the replica Inya's Epiphany. Now, the replica Inya's Epiphany mainly is different from the non-replica version in that it gives you some additional regen per power charge, but also the movement speed scales off power charges. So if you have 10 power charges, that is 50% increased movement speed. At 12 power charges, that's 60% increased movement speed. Pretty much some of the fastest boots we can get. However, if you are using the Ephemeral Bond Amulet, you have to stay in combat all the time, or that movement speed is going to reduce to 0 rather fast. As for the Tailwind option, Stormbrand is one of the only skills in the game that doesn't benefit from Tailwind in terms of DPS. The brands continue to activate at the exact same rate. This has been tested many times, and you can even see this when you enable Tailwind in PoB. You have to consider that when you're buying a well-rolled pair of Tailwind boots, you're paying a premium because of all the other people that are willing to buy these because it gives them increased DPS. It doesn't give you increased DPS. And considering that Tailwind is only worth 8% increased action speed, its main benefit comes from giving you extra movement speed. If your Tailwind boots do not have a good movement speed roll on them, it's actually not even worth getting Tailwind on them. It's better to just get 35% increased movement speed as a roll on your two-toned boots than getting a low movement speed roll plus Tailwind. We have a lot of potential Watcher's Eyes to choose from, and a lot of this is going to come down to plugging in the Watcher's Eyes on trade into your POB and seeing which ones are better for you, and then also determining whether it fits your budget. So the absolute cheapest ones that you're typically going to find are increased lightning damage or increased crit chance with Wrath. Not much else to say here, they're just an easy way to get a bit of extra damage into your build, though you should be careful if you're approaching the crit cap, you may not want the crit chance one. After that, there's the Lightning Pen with Wrath, typically going to be a little more expensive, and in most setups it's going to offer you more DPS than the other two options, but depending on other factors it may not, so you really should check for yourself. Now, an unconventional option, but something I would recommend if you're really concerned about survivability, is getting a Wrath Watcher's Eye that also grants damage leached as life while affected by Vitality. A couple leagues ago they buffed Vitality, and they also buffed the Vitality Watcher's Eye mods. The damage leached as life while affected by Vitality is actually offering quite a bit of leech compared to the other options available in the game, and it's going to just make it a lot easier to survive against a lot of the sources of degen in the game. However, it's absolutely not necessary. If you're comfortable using life flasks, you can absolutely skip out on this. Before I made the guide, these were worth almost no money at all. I think I bought mine for something like 30C, but in recent weeks they have shot up to be worth several exalts if you get good ones. So you may want to think about whether it's not actually worth getting for you. The more expensive options are to get a 2-mod Watcher's Eye. Now, typically you're going to get something with Zealotry and something with Wrath. This will require the Redeemer base helm that gives reduced mana reservation in addition to a level 4 enlightened, so that you can fit both of these auras in, but it's going to give you a lot of increased damage, though, to be sure, not necessary. These are the top end of min-maxing, and some of these are going to cost you 20 exalts plus, so again, you should POB these and figure out for yourself whether it's worth it or not. The absolute highest level are to get double penetration Watcher's Eyes. Again, this requires Wrath and Zealotry, but you can get about 25% elemental penetration, which is quite a lot. They're going to also be very expensive. And after that, there are the triple mod Watcher's Eyes. At the time that I wrote the written guide, none of those were even on the market. I've seen a few come up since, but they usually come up for about 60 to 100x, so they're probably out of most people's budget, and it's just overkill at that point. I was able to clear pretty much the entire game and insta-phase all the endgame bosses with only a single mod Watcher's Eye, so you don't really have to go this far at all. We only have two options when it comes to timeless jewels, but they're always going to go in the slot shown here, and that is the jewel slot a little bit above and to the left of where a shadow starts, and you're going to convert the low life keystone into a timeless jewel keystone. Now, the budget option is going for a Militant Faith jewel with the Dominus keystone on it in a Conviction. In a Conviction allows us to gain more spell damage per power charge. It's not quite the amount of extra damage we're going to get from having Frenzy Charges, but it does allow us to pass up on having to generate Frenzy Charges and also invest into a Badge of the Brotherhood to have additional maximum Frenzy Charges. So it's 3% more damage compared to 4% more damage and 4% increased cast speed from a Frenzy Charge, which is quite a lot of extra damage to have considering we don't have to get a Badge of the Brotherhood. There are a lot of different versions of this jewel, and the extra stats per 10 devotion cannot be Divine Orbed, so keep that in mind that it doesn't really matter what keystone you buy, as long as you have the stats per 10 devotion that you want, because you can divine into the Dominus keystone, you can't divine into the correct stats. Now, the correct stats tend to be getting 4% increased brand, elemental, or area damage per 10 devotion, and 2% to all elemental resistances per 10 devotion. We only are going to get 55 devotion, however, so you're only going to get 20% increased damage and 10% ores, but they're free stats, and in a build that's elemental resist starved, it's hard to pass up these bonuses. It's going to cost a little bit more money, but it's definitely worth doing. The premium option is the Glorious Vanity Jewel. Now you're going to want to get the Doriani Keystone, and this is going to give us Corrupted Soul, which is the same thing that Replica Soul Tether gives us. This is 20% of our max life as extra max energy shield. This is a bonus amount of energy shield, it's not a conversion. So we don't lose any life, we just gain a lot of extra ES off this, and this is pretty important. If you want to level 100, I highly recommend using this jewel. If you're only interested in killing bosses and just clearing content fast, I would recommend going for the Militant Faith instead. But this one's up to you. The Glorious Vanity is going to typically cost about 5 exalts at the start of a league, so it may not even be attainable on a budget anyway, so this one's up to you. For large cluster jewels, we don't really have many options, but by far the best option is to get a large cluster jewel that has Vengeful Commander, Widespread Destruction, and Stormdrinker on it. Now, we don't actually take the Widespread Destruction notable, but rather we want it on the jewel because it allows your jewel to position this notable at the back and position the notables that you do want right before the jewel slots. This means that for a 5-point investment, you can pick up both of the important notables plus the jewel slots. If you're going to be doing this, I highly recommend getting only an 8 passive skill large cluster jewel. The alternative is getting simply the Stormdrinker and the Vengeful Commander notables without the Widespread Destruction, but as you can see here, this is going to cost you 7 points to get both of those notables plus the jewels, so you're spending 2 extra points, but these jewels are much cheaper to get, as opposed to the one that also has Widespread Destruction positioned at the back. There are some other combinations of notables that will achieve the same effect as the premium version of the jewel that only costs 5 points. However, I don't know them off the top of my head. You'll probably either want to punch them into BOB to test for yourself, or just buy some and figure it out, and then resell the ones that you don't end up needing. Medium brand cluster jewels are not the highest DPS option that we have available to us, as that is taken by the aura jewels. However, they do provide us with a lot of damage whilst providing us with a lot of brand functionality that we just can't get anywhere else. The first notable that I'm going to talk about is the Holy Conquest notable. Getting this allows your brands to constantly attach and reattach themselves to enemies multiple times a second, and that means you're getting your damage much more immediately, and it's going to allow your impulsor explosions to be more evenly spread. Additionally, when we use Penance Brand for Delirious content, it's going to allow your Penance Brand to constantly explode for smaller amounts of damage, rather than wait 2 seconds and explode once every few seconds, which is going to leave you dead since mobs have time to attack you. The other brand jewel that we're going to get are lots of brand loyalty plus grand design jewels. Getting these 2 notables on the same jewel gives you 40% increased brand attachment range, 10% more damage, 10% increased brand activation frequency, and 10% increased brand duration. These are by far the best in slot brand jewels that you can get, and they're pretty much what allow you to off-screen all your enemies. The only other thing worth noting with brand cluster jewels is the Remarkable notable. I wouldn't really recommend this, but when it's earlier in a league, you're going to be using an Agnerod West staff. That's going to leave you with much lower cast speed, so it's going to be harder to get your brands out when you're in danger. With Remarkable, it's giving you increased cast speed to get them out faster. It's also going to give you a chance to create an additional brand per cast. If you have 3 of these nodes, it's going to be guaranteed 2 brands per cast. And on top of that, it's just going to allow you to roll your brand jewels earlier in a league and have a wider pool of potential notables that you can hit without really gimping yourself. But once you upgrade to Void Batteries, I would absolutely recommend getting rid of all your Remarkable notables and just going for the brand loyalty plus grand design jewels. The Cursed Cluster Jewel is something I've been a little bit reluctant to talk about, and the reason for this is because it's not the most efficient way to obtain Unnerved Counter Strike. It's better to obtain these effects from the gloves because you don't really have much else you can obtain from your gloves, and obtaining it from a cluster jewel means giving up brand functionality. Now, the other thing to mention is that getting the medium cluster jewel that gives both Unnerve and Culling Strike is going to set you back about 7 exalts. You can pretty much make a pair of gloves for about the same price, and it's hard to argue for getting a suboptimal jewel for that same amount of money that you're going to eventually replace in a min-maxed setup. If you do want to get a Cursed Cluster jewel, particularly because it's earlier in a league and you don't have a lot of access to brand jewels, I would recommend going for the budget version of the jewel. The budget version of the jewel allows you to get either Unnerve or Culling Strike, and then pick up Blind on hit plus 5% more damage taken to enemies. These jewels are very cheap and still pretty efficient to run, especially early in a league. As for Unnerve and Culling Strike themselves, you can obtain both of these effects either through the Culling Strike support gem or the Blade Blast gem, which unnerves enemies on hit. So whichever one you don't have on the budget jewel, you can just fit into your build somewhere else. Regular jewels of the Cobalt or Crimson variety play the role of wildcard in our build. We can get pretty much any stat that we want here, although they are the most efficient way to obtain large amounts of crit multi, and it's important to keep that in mind. Whilst you're min-maxing the build at the start, you're going to be typically starved on dex or resistances, and jewels are a really great way to obtain these. We have a lot of options, and the written guide offers all the different options that you can look for at all different budgets, and I'll go through these real quick. So the absolute budget level of jewel is to just get increased max life with some resistances and attributes depending on what you need, or you can get life, resistances, and damage mods. Again, it's really important to note that crit multi is by far the strongest damage mod you can get, and any other damage mod that you find on a jewel is going to be far weaker in comparison, so don't make the mistake of overestimating how much damage you're getting from having increased crit chance and increased area damage on a jewel. They utterly pale in comparison to additional crit multi. Now, the mid-range jewels you're going to look for will have increased max life. They're going to have one crit multi mod and two regular damage mods usually. They're not particularly expensive because, again, you're paying the premium on having life with lots of crit multi, but they're still going to be quite a big damage boost, especially once you approach the crit cap. The premium options are just going for either 2 crit multi mods or 3 crit multi mods, or in some cases where you really just want to min-max damage and don't care about life, you can get 4 crit multi mods on a single jewel. These are all very expensive. There are some tricks to crafting them via harvest, but it's typically not worth pursuing these because at the end of the day, it's better to just buy. It's going to cost you less money if you just buy them straight off the trade site rather than try and make them yourself using augment crits at 2x an attempt. The final jewel that we're going to fit into our build, and something that is pretty important to us, is having a chaos damage and fire damage dispels jewel. And we do this because the fire damage dispels, in addition to our high crit chance, is going to allow us to ignite everything, and that gives us the damage taken benefit from a Cinder Swallow urn. Having additional chaos damage dispels is going to allow us to poison for the sake of Delirium maps. In Delirium maps, we heavily utilize self-poisoning, and it's better to run chaos damage dispels rather than fizz damage dispels because the fizz damage is just going to be converted to lightning damage when we're using Penance Brand anyway, and even if it wasn't being converted and you're just using Stormbrand, you then have to worry about physical reflect mods being rolled, which we'd completely rather ignore. Chaos damage does the job and doesn't give us any headaches. You're also going to want to get additional flat max life on this jewel just because you can fit it in and it's not going to cost you a lot of money to do so. We have a lot of options with Flasks, and I'm going to try and give a thorough rundown of all the options. However, I really would recommend using the written guide for this section of the build because there are just so many options, and it's really important to read through them all and figure out what you need for yourself based on things like your budget and the type of content you're doing. The first flask slot is, I'd probably recommend going for a Quicksilver Flask of Heat. It's going to let you move faster, and it's also going to give you immunity to chill and freeze. Not much else to say there, but it allows you to interact fearlessly with strong boxes because they can freeze you upon being opened, and that's always going to result in your death if you're not running one of these flasks. The second flask slot goes to a Cinder Swallow urn, or a quartz, or a silver flask. Now, there are a lot of differences here. If you're doing deli content, you're actually going to want both a Cinder Swallow and a quartz flask, which you could put the quartz flask in another slot, but the Cinder Swallow urn is pretty much always the best option here. It gives you onslaught, it gives you a lot of life, ES, and mana recovery, and it's going to allow you to deal 10% more damage to enemies that are ignited, Now, we'll talk about the way you ignite enemies a bit later on, but the important thing to understand about the Cindersword Urn is that, aside from being expensive, it's also going to come with another bonus mod at the bottom here. That mod is going to be Veiled, and you should browse through all the options and determine what you want. You can get additional movement speed here, you can get life regen, you can even get crit chance, which is pretty good if you're below the crit cap. The third slot should pretty much always go to a life flask, though given your circumstances, such as whether you're running really high mana reservation, you may want a hybrid or a mana flask. Now, you pretty much always want these flasks to be seething and of staunching. Seething allows the life recovery to work instantly, so you can just spam the flask when you're getting low on health and it's just going to instantly pop you back up. And of staunching effects provides immunity and removal of bleed. This also means you can skip out on getting a corrupted blood immunity jewel elsewhere. The fourth slot is going to go to Bottled Faith or Diamond Flasks. So when you're at lower amounts of crit, going for Diamond Flask is going to give you the greatest benefit since it makes your crits lucky. However, once you start to approach higher amounts of crit, you'll notice that Diamond Flask has diminishing returns. It doesn't really give you that much benefit since you're already more likely to crit than not. Putting a Bottled Faith in at this point pops you up very close to 100% crit due to this mod here that gives you additional base crit, and also the fact that Consecrated Ground gives you 100% increased crit chance. On top of these benefits, you're going to get increased damage from both the implicit mod and the explicit mod. Consecrated Ground created during effect applies 8%, well, 8 to 10% increased damage taken to enemies. This is a very expensive flask, but it's very useful. I'd recommend looking into this when you're starting to kill bosses very fast, because popping this with Vile Skills allows you to more than double your damage output during that little window that they're all active. So, and that's usually going to be about 6 seconds in most setups. And you're going to be able to pretty much kill the boss in that window rather than the full 15 seconds or whatever you're taking. Now, the last slot goes to a Wise Oak. Wise Oak is a little bit of a complicated item, but the most important thing that you need to know is that as long as your uncapped lightning resistance is the highest out of all of them, then you're going to be getting 15% lightning damage penetration, which makes this a really strong slot for a flask. If you can't afford to arrange your resists in such a way, you should pretty much look into an Ad-Serious Promise. However, it is important to note a lot of people try and perfectly balance their resists to get the 10% reduced damage taken of each element. This part's not really that important, especially with this build. 10% reduced damage taken is not going to be the difference between living and dying in a lot of situations, since we mostly just die to one-shots or standing in chaos damage degen. But this is totally up to you. If you can't get the lightning damage, go for the Ad-Serious Promise. Now, Ad-Serious Promise is going to give you 15% of your elemental damage as extra chaos damage. This is really cheap. You can get a 14% roll for only a few chaos a couple of days into a league. It's not as strong as a Wise Oak, but it's still close to being almost as strong. So it's definitely an option you should consider. And it also gives you additional chaos resistance. This is something we completely lack in our build, so it's also providing survivability and chaos damage leech, which you're going to have from this flask. So yeah, nothing else to say here other than it's a good flask. I wouldn't recommend doing 100% Delirium maps unless you know how to make such a map and you've done your research on them. There are many helpful videos by people like Grimrow Path of Math on this, and you really should look it up before you attempt it yourself. However, if you do know what you're doing, these are the changes we're going to make in order to allow ourselves to do 100% Delirium maps. So the first one is that we're going to be running Chaos Damage Dispels via a jewel. This was already talked about. It's the same jewel that you run Fire Damage Dispels on. This allows us to poison on hit. We're then going to add the Golden Rule jewel. Now this basically allows our poisons to be reflected back onto us, which is explained later. We're going to swap our Mistwalker Ascendancy to Noxious Strike to give us Poison Chance, as you can't actually poison unless you have Poison Chance, even if you're critting every time. And taking Noxious Strike is also going to increase our poison duration. This is really important for maintaining 100 stacks of poison on ourselves. Next, we're going to swap Stormbrand and Concentrated Effect to Penance Brand and Fizz the Lightning Damage support. The reason for this is that when self-poisoning, we'll use this sextant over here that causes players to take plays to deal 12% increased damage for each poison on them, and to have 6% increased movement speed for each poison on them. This stacks up to 100, which is 1,200% increased damage. Now, when you consider all the increased damage we're already getting on our tree and from our void batteries, it's probably closer to only about double our damage, but this increases our explosions from 5% of the enemy's life to 65% of the enemy's life. This makes our explosions pretty invaluable, and by using Penance Brand, we can start getting access to those explosions much faster rather than having to wait for Stormbrand to tick a single target down. Now, next up we want to use either a Maw of Conquest or Boots that have the elevated mod unaffected by poison. The boots are going to be by far the more expensive option. At the start of the league, they're probably going to be about 15 exalts, but they quickly fall to about 5 or 4 exalts later on in the league, whereas a Maw of Conquest helm is going to cost 1 C most of the time. Both give unaffected by poison, and it's really important that you have this, as if you don't have unaffected by poison, doing this setup is going to just constantly kill yourself. Now, one last thing to note is that the reason why we swap the Mistwalker Ascendancy out is because it's the Ascendancy that provides us with the least benefit. All the other Ascendancies provide us with a lot of damage, and Mistwalker's main benefit is giving us movement speed. However, we already have 600% increased movement speed in Delirium maps, so we don't really need anything that Elusive is giving us. When it comes to gems, our 6-link setup is going to feature Stormbrand, Swiftbrand support, Divergent Inspiration support, Power Charge on Critical Strike support, Concentrated Effect support, and either Controlled Destruction or Awakened Controlled Destruction, depending on what you can afford at the time. Now, it's important to understand that the reason we get Divergent Inspiration support is because it just offers even more mana cost reduction as opposed to the default Inspiration support, but if you can't afford it, it's okay to just run the default Inspiration support. As for the 4 links, we're going to be running Brand Recall plus Flame Dash plus level 1 Arcane Surge plus Second Wind in one of them, and this can go in our boots, helm, or gloves. For our debuffs, we're going to run Wave of Conviction plus Blade Blast usually, in addition to Culling Strike and Increased Duration. This is going to give us the largest possible duration on the Elemental Exposure debuff and the Unnerve from Blade Blast. However, if you're running Unnerve and Culling Strike from Jewels or Gloves, you can simply run Wave of Conviction with Hex Touch and Conductivity and Elemental Weakness. Now, if you get a level 5 Awakened Hex Touch support, that will give you +1 curses. However, you can also obtain +1 curses from a Hunter Crusader body armor, and if you're not running +1 curses at all, you can simply just run one of these curses. It doesn't really matter that much. For auras, we have a few options here. I'm going to go through them. So the highest DPS option is typically to go Wrath, Zealotry, level 4 Enlighten, and level 1 Precision. However, the version of the aura setup that I would recommend for the most comfortable playstyle is simply running Wrath with level 12 to 16 Clarity, which we use to have enough mana regen to Brand Recall on cooldown, level 1 to 10 Vitality. Now, if you're using Vitality for the Watcher's Eye mod, you're only going to want a level 1. However, running level 10 Vitality is going to give you a lot of extra regen, which will counter degen and other sources of damage. It also means you don't have to rely on hitting your potions as fast. It's just much more comfortable to play this way, and then still running level 1 Precision. Now, in addition to these two setups, you can also put in a level 21 Discipline instead of the Clarity gem, and this is going to give you a lot of extra energy shield. I'd recommend running this in conjunction with the Corrupted Soul Keystone if you're trying to level up, but only if you're trying to level up. Otherwise, stick to the Wrath, Clarity, Vitality, Precision setup mentioned here. As for your wands, the best setup, in my opinion, are to run a level 7 to 10 Val Haste, which we're only going to run a low level Val Haste because otherwise your dex requirement is going to be too high and you have to acquire it from Jewels, which isn't really worth it. We're going to run Val Righteous Fire to stack both buffs during boss killing, and then increase duration support, so that both of those buffs last about 6 seconds. Increased duration support does mean that it takes longer to recharge these skills, but we only ever need them for bosses, so we only get one use out of them per map anyway. As for your other wand, typically want to run an unlinked portal gem in addition to a portal gem that is linked to cast on death support. When you're starting out with this build, you're going to die a lot. Now, it is possible to set this build up so that it has almost 8k EHP, and I've even leveled to 100 with that setup. However, this will take quite a while and quite a lot of money to get to that point, so you may as well just accept that death is an inevitability and run cast on death with portal. This is going to save you a lot of time, and at the end of the day, in softcore, you have 6 portals. If you're running this setup, each death is only going to cost you 5 seconds or so per map, and that's far less time than what you're going to save by running a really tanky setup and sacrificing all your damage with other builds. So that concludes my Stormbrand Assassin Guide. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact me on Discord or in-game. The details are in the descriptions below. And if there's anything you're unsure about, feel free to consult my written guide, which is far more detailed and contains a few things that this video didn't. Other than that, I'm going to leave you with some gameplay clips, some maps and whatnot, just so you can see what Stormbrand performs like when it's min-maxed to about a tune of 60 to 80 exalts.